The stagecoach groaned, its wheels spitting dust and gravel as it surrendered to the finality of its journey. The town it had arrived at was little more than a scar on the sun-scorched earth, a place called Redemption Creek that seemed to offer none. Buildings of bleached, splintering wood slumped against each other for support, their windows like vacant eyes staring out at the endless, shimmering heat of the Arizona frontier. When the door swung open, it was Clara who stepped out first, a solitary figure against the harsh glare of the afternoon. She paused on the packed dirt of the main street, a creature from another world. Her dress, a deep blue muslin, was finely made but travel-worn and coated in a pale film of dust. In one hand, she clutched the handle of a single scuffed valise, as if it were the only anchor holding her to the ground. Her other hand, gloved in fraying lace, trembled at her side, a small, betraying motion that she tried to still by pressing it against her skirt. Her face was a pale oval beneath the brim of her modest bonnet, her features delicate, but it was her eyes that held the town captive for a moment. They were the color of a stormy sea, wide and haunted, darting from the saloon's swinging doors to the grim facade of the sheriff's office, searching for a threat that was not yet visible but felt in the very air she breathed. A few men loitering on the porch of the general store stopped their whittling to watch her. A woman sweeping her stoop paused, her broom held motionless. They saw a pretty thing, fragile and out of place, but they also saw a mystery. And in a town like Redemption Creek, mysteries were currency, to be traded in whispers and speculation. The stagecoach driver, a grizzled man with a tobacco-stained beard, heaved her trunk to the ground with a grunt. "This is it, Miss Redemption Creek." He said it not as a welcome, but as a warning. Clara swallowed, her throat as dry as the dust under her worn boots. She approached a small group of townsfolk who had gathered, their curiosity overriding their daily chores. I am looking for Mr. Abernathy," she said, her voice softer than the wind, forcing them to lean in. "The shopkeeper, he sent for me." A silence fell over the small crowd. An older man, the blacksmith by the look of his leather apron, removed his hat and rubbed a hand over his bald head. "Mr. Abernathy." "Miss?" he said, his voice laced with a pity that felt sharp and dangerous to Clara. "He passed on, took ill with a fever near a fortnight ago. We buried him up on the hill." Clara's face, already pale, lost its last hint of color. Her knuckles went white where she gripped her valise. This was her story, the one she had rehearsed for 1,000 miles, the lie that was meant to be her shield. She had read the advertisement, picked the name from a town far enough away to feel safe. She had not counted on the man actually being dead. The tremor in her hand worsened. "Oh," she whispered, the sound lost in the vast, indifferent landscape. "I see. I did not know." The whispers started then, a low rustle like dry leaves skittering across the dirt. A mail-order bride, arriving for a dead man. It was a story too strange to be wholly believed, yet too grim to be dismissed. Suspicion and a grim sort of curiosity warred on their faces. They saw her fine, worn dress, the single valise, the absence of any family or escort. They saw a woman unescorted and unclaimed. And in the West of 1880, that was a dangerous thing to be. Across the street, Colt Brenner straightened from his work. A length of fresh-cut pine balanced on his shoulder. He had been delivering a load of lumber to the new assayer's office, his muscles coiled and hard from the labor. He was not a handsome man in the way of city folk. The sun had carved fine lines around his eyes and browned his skin to the color of worn leather. His jaw was firm, his hands calloused, and his gaze was direct and unflinching. He had noticed her the moment she stepped from the coach. He had seen beautiful women before, women with bold laughs and confident strides who passed through Redemption Creek on their way to somewhere better. Clara was not like them. It was not her beauty that held his attention, though she possessed it in a quiet, understated way. It was the flicker of raw panic in her eyes, a frantic, hunted look she tried to mask with a veneer of composure. It was a look he knew. He had seen it in the eyes of a cornered coyote, in the gaze of a man about to be hanged, and on the rare occasions he dared to look, he had seen it in his own reflection. She was hiding something, not out of deceit, but out of sheer, bone-deep terror. He watched as the townsfolk surrounded her, their questions and stares like vultures circling, and he felt an unwelcome tug of something akin to understanding. He shifted the lumber on his shoulder and went back to his work, but his eyes kept drifting back to the lone woman in the dusty blue dress. Clara managed to extricate herself from the crowd, murmuring her thanks with a downcast gaze. Her story was flimsy. She knew, but it was all she had. She inquired about lodging and was directed to a run-down inn at the far end of the street, a 2-story building that sagged in the middle as if weary of its own existence. She paid for a room for a week with the few coins she had left. The innkeeper's wife, a sour-faced woman named Mrs. Gable, eyeing her with undisguised suspicion. The room was small and airless, furnished with a narrow bed, a rickety washstand, and a single chair. The window looked out onto a dusty alley littered with refuse. As soon as the door clicked shut behind her, the facade Clara had so carefully constructed crumbled. She leaned against the door, her breath coming in ragged gasps, her whole body shaking. She slid to the floor, wrapping her arms around her knees, and finally let the tears come. They fell silently, tracing clean paths through the grime on her cheeks. She did not make a sound. She had learned long ago that crying was a privilege, and that making noise only brought more pain. As dusk settled, bleeding purple and orange across the sky, the darkness in her room grew, and with it came the memories. They were not linear thoughts, but jagged fragments, sensory assaults that ambushed her in the quiet, the smell of whiskey on a man's breath, the sharp, stinging pain of a hand across her face, followed by the coppery taste of blood in her mouth. She saw bruises, ugly purple and black blossoms blooming on pale skin. She saw a floor, dark wood stained with something darker still, a crimson pool spreading slowly from a fallen lamp. And she heard screams, a woman's raw, terrified shriek that was swallowed by a man's bellowing rage. Her own screams. She pressed her hands to her ears, rocking back and forth on the floor. But the sounds were inside her, echoes in the hollow chambers of her heart. The gossip in Redemption Creek took root and spread like tumbleweed. The story of the pretty, would-be bride of a dead man was too juicy to be ignored. By the next day, everyone had an opinion. Some said she was an adventuress, a swindler who had gotten her just desserts. Others, the more charitable souls, whispered that she was simply unlucky, a poor thing left adrift. But the most persistent rumor was that she was running from something. Martha, the saloon keeper's wife, was the one who gave that rumor its legs. She was a hard woman, with sharp eyes that missed nothing. When Clara had come into the saloon looking for work, Martha had felt a jolt of recognition. She had studied Clara's face, the high cheekbones, the delicate chin, the haunted eyes. "I've got no work for you," she had said, her tone flat and dismissive. Later that evening, as she was sorting through a stack of old newspapers and notices used for kindling, she found it, a 3-week-old notice from a Texas marshal. It described a woman wanted for questioning in connection with a homestead fire. A reward was offered. The sketch was crude, but it was the eyes that caught her. They were the same stormy, frightened eyes she had looked into that afternoon. The name was different, but the description was close enough. Martha folded the notice and tucked it away in her apron pocket, a slow, cruel smile touching her lips. She would wait, she decided. She would watch the little bird and see which way she tried to fly. The next few days were a special kind of torment for Clara. Her money was nearly gone, and the innkeeper's wife made it clear that charity was not a virtue she possessed. Hunger became a constant, gnawing ache in her belly. She tried to find work, offering to cook, to clean, to mend, but every door was closed to her. The women of the town saw her as a threat, a woman of questionable character, and the men saw her as an opportunity, their eyes lingering on her in a way that made her skin crawl. One afternoon, as she walked back from another fruitless inquiry, the world began to tilt. The edges of her vision grew dark, and the ground seemed to rush up to meet her. She stumbled, catching herself against the rough wall of the blacksmith's shop, her head spinning from weakness. It was then that Colt Brenner rode past. He had been out checking his fences and was heading home, his horse moving at a steady, ground-eating pace. He saw her falter, the way her hand went to her head, the slight sway of her body. He had seen that look before, too. He pulled his horse to a halt and dismounted in one fluid motion. He did not speak at first, just stood a respectful distance away. He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a small cloth bundle. He unwrapped it to reveal a piece of dried venison and a hunk of cornbread. He walked over to her and held it out. Clara flinched when he approached, her eyes wide with alarm. She stared at the food, then at his face. His expression was unreadable, his gaze steady. She saw no pity in his eyes, only a quiet, factual acknowledgement of her need. "No, thank you," she said, her voice a reedy whisper. To accept help was to be indebted, and she could not bear the weight of another debt. Colt did not withdraw his hand. "You need to eat," he said, his voice a low rumble. It was not a request or a suggestion. It was a statement of fact. Her pride warred with a desperate, clawing hunger inside her. Her stomach cramped painfully, a visceral reminder of her own frailty. She looked from his impassive face to the food in his hand, and her resolve broke. With a trembling hand, she reached out and took it. Her fingers brushed against his, and she felt the rough callus of his skin, a warmth that was startling. "Thank you," she mumbled, her gaze fixed on the ground. "Just eat," he said, and without another word, he turned, mounted his horse, and rode out of town, leaving her standing in the shadow of the blacksmith's shop, clutching the first act of kindness she had received in a lifetime. That small meal gave her the strength to try again. She found work, finally, in the one place she had been dreading, the saloon. Not as one of the painted girls upstairs, but in the kitchen. The work was brutal. From noon until well after midnight, she washed greasy pots and pans, peeled potatoes, and scrubbed floors, her hands quickly becoming red and raw. The heat from the stove was suffocating, and the air was thick with the smell of stale beer, sweat, and frying meat. Worse than the labor was the atmosphere. The men who drifted in from the bar to the kitchen would leer at her, making crude jokes meant for her to overhear. The other kitchen girl, a hardened woman named Sadie, treated her with a mixture of contempt and jealousy. The women of the town, who saw her entering and leaving the saloon each day, solidified their opinions. Their whispers followed her down the street, sharp and cruel as stones. Clara learned to endure it all. She built a wall inside herself, a place of quiet numbness where the words and the stares could not reach her. She did her work, collected her meager pay, and returned to her lonely room, the memories her only constant companions. One night, she was later than usual. A poker game had run long, and she had stayed to clean up the last of the mess. When she finally pushed open the back door of the saloon and stepped into the alley, a figure detached itself from the shadows. It was Silas, a drunkard and a bully who had been eyeing her for days. He smelled of cheap whiskey and unwashed linen. "Well now, look what we have here," he slurred, blocking her path. "Little lost bird, all alone in the dark." Clara's heart hammered against her ribs. She tried to step around him, but he moved to block her again, a smirk on his face. "No need to hurry off. Thought we could get to know each other a little better." He reached for her, and she stumbled backward, her hand flying to her throat. Panic, cold and sharp, seized her. It was happening again. The same smell, the same leering eyes, the same sense of being trapped. A scream built in her throat, but it was strangled by fear.
"Leave her be, Silas."
The voice was low and calm, but it cut through the tense alley air like a whip crack. Colt Brenner stood at the mouth of the alley, a silhouette against the lantern-lit street. He had been on his way out of town and had seen Silas follow her out the back. Silas turned, his drunken bravado faltering slightly. "This ain't none of your concern, Brenner." Colt took a slow step forward. He did not raise his voice. He did not clench his fists. He simply moved, positioning his body between Silas and Clara, creating a solid, unbreachable shield. He never once looked at her or touched her, but she had never felt so protected in her life. His focus was entirely on the other man. "I'm making it my concern," Colt said, his voice dropping even lower, carrying a deadly quiet. "The lady's tired. She wants to go home. You're going to let her pass." Silas looked from Colt's unwavering gaze to the confident set of his shoulders. He saw no anger in Colt's face, but something far more dangerous, a calm, absolute certainty. He was a man who had seen violence and was not afraid of it. Silas, for all his bluster, was a coward. He grumbled something under his breath, shot Clara a venomous look, and shuffled off down the alley, disappearing into the darkness. Colt did not move until Silas was gone. He remained a silent guardian in the shadows. Clara stood frozen, her breath catching in her throat, the terror slowly receding, leaving a tremor in its wake. "You can go now," he said softly, still not looking at her. "He won't be back tonight." She found her voice, though it was barely a whisper. "Thank you." He turned then, and in the dim light, she could see the hard lines of his face. He nodded once, a curt, small movement. "No need for thanks." He started to walk away, but then he paused and looked back at her over his shoulder. His expression was grim, his eyes holding that same flicker of shared understanding she had seen before. "I know what it's like to run," he said, his voice rough with an old pain. "Don't let the bastards win." He walked away then, his footsteps sure and steady on the dirt street. As he reached his horse, the wind began to pick up, a low moan that heralded a coming storm. It whipped dust and grit through the air, swirling around him as he mounted. Clara watched him disappear into the growing tempest, a lone rider against a darkening world. A gust of wind tore at her dress, and she instinctively wrapped her arms around herself, her fingers tightening over her stomach, as if shielding a secret too fragile and too precious for this brutal, unforgiving land. The memory came at night, a thief in the dark. It did not ask for permission. It simply took her, pulling her back from the flimsy safety of the inn's lumpy mattress to a different place, a different life. She was 16 again, standing on the stoop of the St. Jude's orphanage for girls, the gray wool of her only dress scratching at her skin. He had come for her then. Mr. Elias Thorne, a man with a handsome smile and promises that sounded like prayers answered. He spoke of a small homestead in Texas, a life of partnership, of a home she would never be turned out of. To a girl who had known only charity and cold floors, he seemed like a savior. The reality was a shallow grave for her hopes. The homestead was a dilapidated shack miles from any town, a prison of dust and wind. The pretense of marriage lasted less than a week. She was not his wife, she was his property, another possession he had acquired, cheaper than a good horse and more useful. Her days were an endless cycle of back-breaking labor. She cooked and cleaned, mended his clothes, tended the chickens, and hauled water until her hands were a geography of calluses and blisters. Her nights were worse. He was a man of sour moods and a heavy hand, his kindness a rare and terrifying thing, for it was always a prelude to some greater cruelty. He would praise her biscuits one moment and strike her the next for putting too much salt in the stew. He taught her that love was a fist and tenderness was a lie. The final night was a blur of fire and fear. It had started with a dropped lantern, the smell of whiskey thick in the air. He had been in one of his rages, his face contorted, his voice a roar that seemed to shake the very timbers of the shack. He had cornered her, his shadow swallowing her whole. She remembered the glint of the firelight on the blade of the kitchen knife she had been using to peel potatoes. She remembered a sharp, tearing pain in her own arm as she tried to defend herself, and a spray of warmth. She remembered screaming, a sound of pure animal terror. Then came the fire. It consumed the dry wood of the shack with a hungry roar, licking up the walls, turning her prison into an inferno. She did not remember starting it, but she did not remember trying to put it out, either. All she remembered was running, the heat of the flames at her back, the night air cold on her face. She ran until her lungs burned and her legs gave out, a bloody kerchief clutched in her hand, one she had used to staunch the flow of blood from his arm, or hers. She could no longer be sure. She had left him in the flames, and she had never looked back. In the present, the memory left her gasping for air, her nightgown soaked in a cold sweat. Redemption Creek was her chance to bury that girl, to become someone new, but ghosts had a way of following. A few days later, while she was at the town well, the tin bucket heavy in her hands, she heard a voice that made the blood freeze in her veins. It was the sheriff, a new man named Brody who had arrived the week before. He was a tall man with a methodical way about him, different from the lazy, complicit lawman he had replaced. He was speaking to the blacksmith. "Just asking around," Sheriff Brody said, his voice calm and carrying on the still morning air. "Got a wire from a ranger down in Texas. Seems a homesteader named Thorne, man who was thought to have died in a fire 6 months back. Turned up alive, beaten and burned, but alive. He's looking for the wife who ran off on him. Said she might have headed this way." Clara's fingers went numb. The handle of the bucket slipped, and it crashed to the ground, water sloshing over her dusty boots. The sound was deafeningly loud in the sudden silence of her world. Both men turned to look at her. She saw suspicion in the blacksmith's eyes, and a cool, professional curiosity in the sheriff's. "Apologies," she stammered, her voice a stranger's. She bent to retrieve the bucket, her movements jerky and uncoordinated. Her heart was a wild bird beating against the cage of her ribs. He was alive, the monster she thought she had escaped. The ghost she had been outrunning had a name and a face, and he was looking for her. The fire had not set her free. It had only bought her time. She did not see Colt Brenner leaning against the far wall of the general store, watching the scene unfold. He saw the sheriff's assessing gaze. He saw the way Clara's body went rigid with fear, the tremor that shook her as she drew the bucket back up from the well. He saw her scurry away, her head down, a frightened mouse desperate for a crack to hide in. He pushed himself off the wall, a grim set to his jaw. He knew that look. It was the look of a trapped animal that has just heard the hunter's footsteps. He found her later, near the edge of town, where the buildings gave way to open scrubland. She was just standing there, staring out at the vast, empty horizon, as if she were contemplating walking into it and never stopping. He approached her quietly, his footsteps soft on the packed earth. "You all right?" he asked, his voice low. She jumped, startled, a small cry escaping her lips. She spun around, her eyes wide with a frantic, cornered terror. When she saw it was him, some of the fear receded, replaced by a deep, weary shame. She said nothing, just turned back to the horizon. Colt did not press her. He did not ask what the sheriff had said or why it had frightened her so. He just stood beside her, a quiet, solid presence. "This is hard country," he said after a long moment. "It has a way of finding a body's weak spots." Tears welled in her eyes, blurring the distant mountains into a wavering line. She would not let them fall. She would not give him, or this town, her tears. "I don't have any weak spots," she lied, her voice choked. "I am fine." He looked at her, at the proud, desperate set of her shoulders, at the trembling of her hands clasped tightly in front of her. He knew she was lying, but he also knew that sometimes a lie was the only thing a person had to hold on to. "All right," he said softly. "You're fine." He did not believe her, but he let her keep the lie. A small act of mercy that she felt more keenly than any kindness. In the days that followed, Clara tried to make herself smaller, to become invisible. She kept to the saloon kitchen and her small room, but a new resolve had taken root in her fear. She would not just be a victim. She started seeking out small ways to be a part of the town, not for acceptance, but for a sense of purpose. She learned that Mrs. Gable, the sour innkeeper's wife, had an elderly mother, Mrs. Peterson, who was mostly bedridden. Clara began to spend her mornings, before her work at the saloon, at the widow's small cottage, helping with the laundry, reading to her from a tattered Bible, and tending to the 2 young grandchildren the widow was raising, both of whom were struggling with a summer fever. Mrs. Peterson was a kind woman with eyes that had seen much of life's sorrow and had not been hardened by it. She did not ask Clara about her past. She simply accepted her help with a grateful smile in that small, quiet cottage. Clara felt a flicker of peace, tending to the sick children. She was no longer the haunted woman from the saloon or the mysterious bride of a dead man. She was just Clara, a woman with gentle hands and a quiet voice, capable of soothing a fevered brow. She was kind, and in being kind, she remembered a part of herself she thought had died in Texas. But the town's suspicion was a stubborn weed. The whispers did not cease. They intensified. Her kindness to the old widow was twisted into a new narrative. She was trying to curry favor, to worm her way in. Martha, the saloon-keeper's wife, watched her with a hawk's predatory gaze, her lips curled in a knowing smirk. She was waiting for the right moment to release the information she held, to watch Clara's carefully constructed world come crashing down. That moment came on a sweltering Tuesday afternoon. Someone, Clara would always believe it was Martha, nailed a weathered piece of paper to the notice board outside the general store. It was the reward poster. It was old and creased, but the words were clear enough. Wanted for questioning. Homestead fire. Elias Thorne, Texas. And below the words was the sketch. It was crudely drawn, the lines thick and amateurish. But the artist had captured something essential. He had captured the eyes. They were large and dark, filled with a haunted, hunted expression that was unmistakably hers. Clara saw it from across the street. She had been on her way to Mrs. Peterson's, a small basket of leftover bread in her hand. Her steps faltered. The world seemed to shrink until it was only her and that piece of paper. Her breath caught in her chest, sharp and painful. A small crowd had gathered, murmuring and pointing. She could feel their eyes on her, even from a distance. They were stripping her bare, seeing not a woman, but a fugitive, a criminal, a mystery finally solved. She backed into the shadows of the alleyway between the blacksmith and the livery, her body shaking uncontrollably. It was over. Just as she was about to turn and run, to flee into the wilderness with nothing but the clothes on her back, she saw him. Colt Brenner strode into the center of the crowd. He did not say a word at first. He just looked at the poster, then at the faces of the people gathered around it. His expression was cold, hard as granite. He walked directly to the notice board, and with one sharp, deliberate motion, he tore the poster down. He crumpled it in his fist. The crowd went silent, shocked by his audacity. The blacksmith found his voice first. "Now hold on. Colt, the sheriff will want to see that." Colt turned his cool gaze on the man. "See what?" he said, his voice dangerously quiet. "A bad drawing of a scared woman? That could be anyone. Could be your cousin from back east. Could be my sister, if I had one." He looked around at the crowd, his eyes daring any of them to challenge him. "This town's got enough trouble without us chasing ghosts from Texas. Go on, get back to your business." No one moved for a moment. They were held in place by the force of his will. Then, slowly, they began to disperse, muttering amongst themselves. unwilling to cross Colt Brenner? From the shadows. Clara watched, her hand pressed to her mouth to stifle a sob. He had not done it for her. Not really. He had done it because he was a man who stood against the mob, a man who believed in a different kind of justice. But he had saved her all the same. He had stood between her and the wolves, and she felt a surge of something so powerful and overwhelming it stole her breath. It was a terrifying, fragile thing. Hope. That evening, he sought her out at the back of the saloon. The air was cooling, the first stars beginning to prick the deep purple sky. "It is not going to stop," he said without preamble. "The poster is down, but the talk is not, the sheriff is not a fool. It is only a matter of time." Clara nodded, her eyes fixed on the ground. She knew he was right.
I know.
"I have a ranch," he went on, his voice steady. "North of here. It is small, just me and the cattle. It is calving season. I could use a hand with the cooking, keeping the place in order. It is hard work, and the pay is not much, but it is quiet. No one will find you there." She looked up at him, her heart pounding. His offer was a lifeline, a chance, but it was also a risk. To go with him would be to place her trust, her very life, in the hands of a man she barely knew, a man with his own ghosts. But what was the alternative? Staying here, waiting for Sheriff Brody's hand to fall on her shoulder? "Why?" she whispered. "Why would you do this for me?" He looked away, his gaze settling on the distant, dark line of the mountains. "Because I know what it is like to run," he said, his voice so low she could barely hear it. "And because nobody deserves to be cornered." He met her eyes again. "The choice is yours. I will be leaving at dawn." She knew she would not survive long in town. His ranch was a chance, perhaps her only one. "I will be ready," she said, her voice small but firm. The journey began before the sun had fully risen. In the cold gray light of dawn, the land they rode into was as harsh and unforgiving as the life she had fled. The trail snaked through sun-split rocks and thorny mesquite, the ground hard and dry. Rattlesnakes sunned themselves on the warm stones, their warning buzz a constant, unsettling song. The sky was a vast, empty bowl of blue, offering no shade and no comfort. It was a land that stripped a person down to their essential self, to the core of their will to survive. They rode in silence for hours. The tension between them was a palpable thing, a third presence on the trail. It was a silence born of fear, of unspoken questions, of the enormous risk they were both taking. Clara was acutely aware of him, of the easy way he sat in his saddle, of the broad strength of his back, of the way his eyes constantly scanned the landscape, missing nothing. He was a part of this land, as rugged and resilient as the canyons they rode through. They made camp as dusk fell, the sky turning a brilliant, fiery orange. Colt built a small fire, and they ate dried beef and hardtack in silence, the crackle of the flames the only sound between them. It was then, as the last of the light faded and the immense, star-filled darkness of the wilderness closed in around them, that Clara finally arrived at his small ranch. The cabin was little more than a one-room shelter, built of rough-hewn logs, but a thin curl of smoke rose from its stone chimney, a beacon of warmth in the vast emptiness. Inside, a fire was already burning low in the hearth. The cabin was Spartan but clean, containing a bed, a table, and a few chairs. It was a place of solitude, the home of a man who did not need much from the world. As Colt saw to the horses, the emotional weight of the day, of the past week, of her entire life, came crashing down on Clara. The escape from town, the fear of the sheriff, the memory of the poster, the kindness of this stranger. It was all too much. She sank to the floor before the hearth, her body trembling. The wall she had so carefully built inside herself shattered, and a sob tore from her throat, raw and ragged. The tears came then, a storm of grief and terror she could no longer hold back. She wept for the girl in the orphanage, for the woman who had endured Elias Thorne's cruelty, for the fugitive who could not stop running. Colt came back inside and saw her crumpled on the floor, her shoulders shaking with the force of her weeping. He stopped, his hat in his hands. He did not rush to her side. He did not offer platitudes or easy comfort. He understood that her grief was a private, sacred thing, a wound that could not be healed by a simple touch. Instead, he walked quietly over to the fire and added a log. Then he sat down on the floor a few feet away from her, his back against the wall, his rifle across his lap. He did not speak. He did not look at her. He just sat there, a silent, unmovable guardian in the firelight. He shared the space with her sorrow, letting her know, without a single word, that she was not alone in the dark. He sat beside her until her sobs quieted into shuddering breaths, and finally, utterly exhausted, she fell into a deep, dreamless sleep on the floor beside the warmth of the hearth. The days settled into a rhythm dictated by the sun and the needs of the land. Life on Colt's ranch was a world away from the suffocating confines of Redemption Creek. Here, the silence was vast and clean, broken only by the lowing of cattle, the cry of a hawk, or the whisper of the wind through the sparse grass. For the first time in as long as she could remember, Clara could breathe. Colt was a patient teacher, his instructions sparse but clear. He started with the horses. He let out a calm, steady mare named Dust Devil and showed Clara how to brush her down, how to speak to her in a low, soothing voice. Then, instead of a saddle, he simply tossed a thick blanket over the mare's back. "Riding bareback teaches you to listen to the horse," he said, his voice a low rumble. "You feel every muscle. You learn balance. Saddles just make you lazy." Her first attempts were clumsy. She was stiff with fear, her body a knot of tension. She clutched at the horse's mane, certain she would fall. But Colt stood nearby, his presence a silent anchor. He did not touch her, did not offer a hand to help her up. He let her find her own way, slowly, cautiously. She began to relax. She learned to move with the horse, to trust the powerful animal beneath her. Soon, she was riding out with him in the cool, blue light of dawn, the wind whipping strands of hair from her braid, a feeling of exhilarating, terrifying freedom swelling in her chest. She learned other things, too. He showed her how to mend the barbed wire fences that stretched for miles across the unforgiving landscape, her soft hands growing tough and calloused. She learned to cook over an open fire, the scent of wood smoke clinging to her clothes and hair. She learned to coax a decent meal from flour, bacon, and beans. During calving season, she was there beside him in the frosty pre-dawn hours, helping to guide a newborn calf into the world, its wet, trembling body a miracle of life in this harsh, demanding land. She would clean the small creature, her movements gentle, her heart aching with a tenderness she had thought long dead. A quiet comfort grew between them, woven from the shared tasks of survival. It was not romance. It was something more fundamental, a partnership born of necessity. It existed in the small, unspoken moments. The way he would leave a tin cup of hot coffee for her by the fire in the morning. The way she would patch a tear in his work shirt without being asked. The shared glance of satisfaction after a long day of branding calves. They worked side by side, two solitary people creating a fragile world of their own against the vast emptiness of the frontier. But beneath the surface of their shared labor, something else flickered. A current of unspoken awareness that was as potent as the silent heat of the midday sun. One evening, as they sat by the fire, the flames painting dancing shadows on the cabin walls, Colt began to speak. His voice was low, his gaze fixed on the fire, as if the story were written in the glowing embers. He told her of his own past, a story as scarred as the land around them. "This place," he began, his voice rough. "It belonged to my family, my PA, my ma, two younger sisters. We worked it from nothing, but there were other men who wanted the water rights to the creek that runs through the south pasture. They tried to buy us out. Pa refused. This was our home." He paused, and the silence that followed was heavy with the weight of memory. Clara watched him, her hands clasped in her lap. She saw the muscles in his jaw tighten. "They came at night," he continued, his voice flat, devoid of emotion, which made the words all the more chilling. "They set fire to the house. I was 16. I was out in the barn with a sick horse. I heard the screams." He fell silent again, and in the quiet, Clara could almost hear them. By the time I got there, it was too late. They shot my PA when he came out the door. The others, they were trapped inside." He looked at his hands then, as if seeing them for the first time. "I survived. I hid in the rocks and watched the house burn, watched them ride away, laughing." He finally looked at her, and his eyes were old, filled with a sorrow so deep it seemed bottomless. "I spent the next 10 years with a gun in my hand. I tracked down every last one of them. I worked as a hired gun, a tracker, a man who did things for money that I am not proud of. I lived on vengeance. But it was a hollow meal. It did not bring them back. It just emptied me out." He showed her a long, pale scar that ran along his forearm, a reminder of a knife fight in a dusty cantina. He had other scars, on his chest and back, a roadmap of a violent life. "One day," he said, his voice barely a whisper, "I just walked away. I came back here, to the ashes, and I started to rebuild. It is all I know how to do." Clara listened, her heart aching for the boy who had lost everything, for the man who had been forged in such a fire of grief and rage. She understood now the source of his quiet strength, the reason he had recognized the hunted look in her eyes. He was a survivor, too. He had looked into the abyss and had somehow found his way back. She wanted to reach out, to touch his hand, to offer some word of comfort, but she did not know how. Her own pain was a locked room inside her, and she did not have the key. So she just sat with him in the firelight, her silent presence a testament to her understanding. Her own trauma remained unspoken, but it lived on the surface of her skin. She flinched when a sudden clap of thunder echoed through the canyons, the sound too much like a gunshot, too much like a door being kicked in. She jumped if he moved too quickly behind her, her body instinctively coiling, ready for a blow. Colt noticed. He began to move more slowly around her, to announce his presence when he entered the cabin, to make no sudden movements. He never mentioned her fear, but his quiet adjustments to accommodate it were a form of care more profound than any words. One night, a strange and magical thing happened. A faint sound drifted on the wind, a lonely, high lonesome tune. It was a fiddle, faint and far away, likely from a group of cowboys camped miles down the valley. The music floated into the cabin, a ghost of a melody filled with longing. Colt looked at Clara, a rare, small smile touching his lips. "Do you know how to dance?" he asked. She shook her head, a blush rising on her cheeks. "No, there was never any dancing at the orphanage." "Me neither," he admitted. He stood up and held out a calloused hand. "But it seems a shame to waste the music." She hesitated, her heart fluttering with a feeling that was equal parts fear and a strange, unfamiliar excitement. She placed her hand in his, and he gently pulled her to her feet. They stood in the small open space in the middle of the cabin, the firelight their only illumination. He placed one hand on her waist, and she rested her other hand on his shoulder. It was the first time they had touched with any intention beyond the simple necessity of work. Her skin tingled where his hand rested. They moved awkwardly at first, two people unaccustomed to grace or gentleness. They shuffled their feet, their movements stiff and uncertain. But then they began to listen to the music, to the rhythm of their own breathing. They looked at each other, and in the dim light, they were not a hardened rancher and a woman on the run. They were just a man and a woman, trying to find a moment of peace in a world that offered very little. The dance was clumsy, but it was honest. It was a fragile, beautiful thing, a small act of defiance against the harshness of their lives. The world intruded a few days later, shattering their quiet sanctuary. 3 riders appeared on the horizon, moving with a confident swagger that set Colt on edge. He had been watching them for a mile, his hand resting casually on the stock of the rifle that was always near. As they drew closer, he recognized them. It was Jed McCluskey and his 2 younger brothers, ranchers from the next valley over, men known for their greed and their cruelty. They reined in their horses a few yards from the cabin, their eyes immediately finding Clara, who had come to stand in the doorway. Jed McCluskey, a big man with a florid face and small, mean eyes, grinned, a slow, predatory expression. "Well now, Brenner," he said, his voice thick with smug satisfaction. "Looks like the rumors are true. You got yourself some company." He spat a stream of tobacco juice near Colt's feet. "Pretty little thing. I recognize her from that poster back in town. The one you were so quick to tear down." Clara felt the blood drain from her face. She backed away from the door, her hand flying to her throat. Colt did not move, but his body went still, a dangerous, coiled stillness. "She is under my protection, Jed," Colt said, his voice low and even. "You and your brothers best be on your way." Jed laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "Protection? We ain't looking to harm her. We are just here to collect what is ours. There is a reward. You see, a tidy sum. We figure we can split it with you. A fair deal. For a man harboring a fugitive." The transformation in Colt was swift and absolute. The quiet rancher vanished, replaced by the man who had survived 10 years with a gun in his hand. His eyes went cold and flat, his face a hard, unreadable mask. His hand dropped to the Colt revolver holstered at his hip, the movement so fluid and natural it was like a part of him. "There is no deal," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, yet carrying with deadly clarity. "You have 10 seconds to turn your horses around. If I see you on my land again, I will not give you a warning." The McCluskey brothers exchanged uneasy glances. They were bullies, not fighters, and they saw the promise of swift, efficient death in Colt's eyes. Jed's bravado faltered. He was not willing to die for a reward. "You are making a mistake, Brenner," he snarled, trying to salvage some of his pride. "We will be back, with the sheriff. You will hang right alongside her." With that, they wheeled their horses around and galloped away, leaving a cloud of dust and a heavy, suffocating silence in their wake. As soon as they were gone, the strength that had been holding Clara up deserted her. A choked sob escaped her lips, and she sank to her knees, her body racked with tremors. Colt was at her side in an instant, the deadly gunman once again replaced by the quiet, protective man she had come to know. He knelt in front of her, but did not touch her. "I am sorry," she wept, the words torn from her. "I have brought this to you. I have brought you nothing but danger." She looked up at him, her face a mask of anguish. "I was never free," she cried, the words a raw, desperate confession. "Not even when I thought he was dead. I have never been free." Colt looked at her, his heart twisting at the sight of her brokenness. He reached out then, his hand gentle as he tilted her chin up, forcing her to meet his gaze. His eyes were fierce, burning with a conviction that seemed to push back the shadows in her own. "You are free now," he said, his voice thick with an emotion she had never heard from him before. "As long as I have breath in me." It was not a promise, it was a vow, a declaration of war against her past, against the world, against anyone who would ever try to harm her again. In that moment, something shifted between them. The unspoken thing that had flickered in the quiet moments between them now burst into flame. That night, the tension in the small cabin was a living thing. They ate their dinner in silence, the air thick with the words that had been spoken, with the vow that hung between them. After, as she stood by the fire, her back to him, he came to stand behind her. She could feel the heat of his body, could hear the sound of his breathing. He gently turned her to face him. He looked down at her, his eyes searching her face in the firelight. And then he lowered his head and kissed her. It was not a gentle kiss. It was slow, aching, and desperate. The kiss of two people starved for warmth, for comfort, for a human connection that was not based on pain or fear. It was a kiss of shared sorrow and newfound hope, a raw, honest expression of everything they could not say. She clung to him, her fingers digging into the rough fabric of his shirt, and he held her as if she were the only solid thing in a world that was spinning apart. Later, in the deep silence of the night, she lay on a bedroll near the fire, and he on his cot across the room, but sleep would not come. The ghosts of her past were relentless, their whispers loud in the darkness. Tears slipped from the corners of her eyes, silent and hot. A soft moan escaped her lips, a sound of pure, undiluted anguish. "I cannot stop thinking about you," she whispered into the darkness, the words a confession of her soul's deepest truth. He had become her anchor, her hope, her obsession. She heard the soft creak of his cot, the quiet pad of his footsteps on the wooden floor. He did not come to her front. He lay down behind her on the narrow bedroll, his body a warm, solid line against her back. He wrapped his arms around her, pulling her close, his embrace not one of passion, but of absolute, unwavering protection. He held her like that, his body a shield against the night, a silent, living promise. He was her armor. The pre-dawn air in the cabin was cold and still, carrying the scent of pine and the ghosts of last night's fire. Clara slipped from her bedroll, her movements as silent as a shadow. She had not slept. She had lain awake, listening to the steady rhythm of Colt's breathing from across the room, feeling the phantom warmth of his arms around her. His vow echoed in her mind, a beautiful, terrible promise. "You are free now, as long as I have breath in me." It was that vow that now compelled her to leave. She had watched him these past weeks, had seen the quiet peace he had carved out for himself in this harsh land. He was a man rebuilding a life from ashes, and she had brought the threat of a new fire to his doorstep. His freedom, his very life, was now tied to her past. To stay would be to make him a fugitive alongside her, to see him look over his shoulder for the rest of his days. The thought was unbearable. The only way to truly set him free was to surrender herself. She dressed quickly in the near darkness, her fingers fumbling with the buttons on her dress. She did not write a note. Words were inadequate, and a letter could be used as evidence against him. She simply took a small sack, filled it with a piece of leftover cornbread, and crept out of the cabin. The air outside was sharp, the sky a deep, star-flecked indigo just beginning to pale in the east. She went to the small corral, her heart a leaden weight in her chest. Dust Devil, the gentle mare, nickered softly as she approached. Clara whispered soothing words, her hands stroking the horse's neck as she slipped the bridle on. She led the mare out onto the trail, not daring to mount until the cabin was a distant, dark shape behind her. Then, with a deep, shuddering breath, she swung herself onto the horse's back and urged her toward Redemption Creek. Colt woke to a silence that felt wrong. The air in the cabin was colder than it should have been. He opened his eyes and knew, instantly, that she was gone. Her bedroll was empty, neatly rolled. He was on his feet in a second, his heart seizing in his chest. A quick glance confirmed his fear. Her small sack was gone. He strode outside into the cold morning light. The tracks were plain to see in the dirt. One horse, heading south. He did not have to wonder where she had gone. A raw, helpless rage warred with a profound ache in his chest. She was trying to save him, and in doing so, she was walking straight into the cage. He threw the saddle on his own horse with a furious efficiency, his movements sharp and angry. He would not let her do this. He would not let the bastards win. The ride to town was an agony for Clara. She was not a skilled rider, and she pushed the mare hard, driven by a desperate urgency to have it over with. She gripped the leather reins with a force that made her knuckles ache, the friction rubbing her palms raw. Each mile closer to town was a step closer to the end, to the cold iron of a jail cell. She did not think of Elias Thorne, or the fire, or the reward. She thought only of Colt, of the quiet safety she had found in his presence, and a single tear, hot and bitter, traced a path through the dust on her cheek. She rode into Redemption Creek as the town was coming to life. The blacksmith was firing up his forge, the smell of coal smoke sharp in the air. A few early risers on the street stopped and stared as she rode down the main street, her face pale and set, her body slumped with exhaustion. She did not have to look for the sheriff. A young deputy, barely out of his teens, stepped out of the office, his eyes widening in recognition. He drew his pistol, his hand trembling slightly. "Hold it right there, ma'am," he said, his voice cracking. Clara pulled the mare to a halt. She did not speak. She simply slid off the horse. Her legs so weak they nearly buckled, she held out her hands in a gesture of surrender. Her palms were scraped and bruised, a testament to her desperate ride. The deputy, looking relieved that he did not have to use his gun, quickly holstered it and took her by the arm. He led her into the jailhouse, the heavy wooden door closing behind them with a sound of utter finality. Sheriff Brody was less merciful than Colt had hoped, and far more efficient. He looked up from his desk as Clara was brought in, his expression one of grim satisfaction. He did not ask her name. He did not ask for her story. He simply took a ring of keys from a hook on the wall and led her to one of the 2 cells at the back of the office. "You have caused a lot of trouble, ma'am," he said, his voice flat as he unlocked the heavy iron door. Clara did not resist. She walked into the cell, a small, dark space that smelled of rust and despair. The door clanged shut, and the sound of the key turning in the lock was the sound of her last hope dying. She sank onto the narrow, hard cot, her bruised hands lying limp in her lap. It was over. Word spread through the town like a prairie fire. The woman from the poster, the fugitive rancher Brenner had been hiding, had been arrested. A crowd began to gather outside the sheriff's office, their faces a mixture of curiosity and malice. They peered through the barred windows, hungry for a glimpse of the criminal. Martha, the saloon keeper's wife, stood at the front, her arms crossed, a vindicated smirk on her face.
Knew she was trouble from the start,
she announced to those around her. Got those guilty eyes. The murmurs grew louder, the whispers turning to open jeers. They did not know her story, but they created one for her. They blamed her for the fire, for the death of a man who was not dead, for crimes they could only imagine. She was an outsider, a mystery, and they poured all their small-town fears and suspicions into the vessel of her guilt. Clara sat on the cot, her head bowed, and let their hatred wash over her. It was the price she had to pay for Colt's freedom. An hour later, a horse galloped into town, its hooves thundering on the hard-packed street. Colt pulled his mount to a skidding halt in front of the jailhouse, swinging from the saddle before the horse had fully stopped. His face was a thundercloud, his eyes blazing with a cold fury. He pushed his way through the jeering crowd, his presence so menacing that they fell back without a word. He threw open the door to the sheriff's office and strode in. "I want to speak with her," he demanded, his voice a low growl. Sheriff Brody looked up, his expression hardening. "That is not possible. Brenner, she is a prisoner, awaiting transfer. She has not been charged with anything," Colt shot back, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. "You have no right to hold her without letting her speak to someone. I have a warrant from Texas, and that is all the right I need," the sheriff said, standing up. "Now, I am telling you to leave. Do not interfere with official business." Colt moved to the bars of Clara's cell. He could see her sitting on the cot, small and broken. Her name was a raw ache in his throat. "Clara," he said, his voice softer now, filled with a desperate urgency. That is enough, Brody said, moving to stand between Colt and the cell. He placed a hand on Colt's chest. I said, "Get out."
Something inside Colt snapped. The years of loss, the simmering rage, the desperate fear of losing the one good thing he had found in this world, it all erupted in a single, violent act. With a roar of pure frustration, he drew back his fist and drove it through the space between the bars of the adjacent empty cell. Catching the sheriff square on the jaw, Brody staggered back, a look of stunned surprise on his face, before crashing into his desk. The deputy, who had been watching with wide, terrified eyes, finally reacted. Drawing his pistol, "Do not move! Brenner!" Colt did not resist. The fire in him was gone, replaced by a cold, weary resignation. He had accomplished nothing, except to get himself locked up. The deputy, with the help of the recovering sheriff, disarmed him and shoved him into the empty cell directly across from Clara's. The door slammed shut, the key turned, and he was a prisoner. For a long time, they just looked at each other through the bars, the jeering of the crowd outside a distant, meaningless noise. The space between them was only a few feet, but it felt like a canyon. Finally, it was Clara who broke the silence, her voice a broken whisper. "You should not have come." "I was not going to let you face this alone," he said, his voice rough. He gripped the bars of his cell, his knuckles white. "Why did you run, Clara? Why did you not trust me?" Tears welled in her eyes and traced paths through the grime on her cheeks. "It was because I trusted you," she said, her voice cracking. "It was because you promised me freedom. I could not let my chains become yours." He looked at her, at the raw pain in her eyes, and his anger melted away, leaving only a profound, aching love. "My chains were forged a long time ago," he said softly. You were the key." And there, in the grim squalor of the Redemption Creek jail, with nothing left to lose and nowhere left to run, she finally told him everything. She spoke of Elias Thorne, of the orphanage, of the promises that had turned to dust. Her voice was flat, detached, as she recounted the years of cruelty, the casual violence, the slow death of her spirit. And then she told him of the last night. "He was drunk," she whispered, her gaze fixed on a point somewhere beyond the walls of the jail. "He had been angry all day. He came at me. He tore my dress. He said a wife's duty was to obey, no matter what." Her breath hitched, and a tremor ran through her body. "I had a kitchen knife in my hand. I had been peeling potatoes for his dinner. He grabbed me, and I was so scared. I raised the knife." She looked at Colt then, her eyes pleading for him to understand. "He lunged at me, and I stabbed him. In the arm, or the shoulder. I do not know. There was so much blood." She took a shuddering breath. "He fell back, screaming. He knocked over the lantern. The oil spread so fast, the whole wall went up in flames. I did not mean for the fire to start. I ran, and I did not look back." She finished her story, and a heavy silence filled the space between them. She waited for his judgment, for the look of disgust, for him to turn away. But when she looked at him, she saw none of that. His expression was grim, his eyes filled with a fierce, terrible understanding. "He attacked you," Colt said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "You defended yourself. I would have done worse. I would have made sure he never got up again." He looked at her, his gaze unwavering, and the love he felt for her was a raw, undeniable force in the small, dark cell. "I do not regret loving you, Clara," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Not for a second, no matter what happens." Her name on his lips, the declaration of his love in this hopeless place, was enough to shatter the last of her defenses. A sob broke from her, a sound of grief and gratitude and a love so fierce it hurt. It was in the late afternoon that the rider arrived. He was a circuit lawman, his clothes covered in the dust of a long journey.
He carried a leather satchel, and he handed a letter to Sheriff Brody with an air of official importance. The sheriff, his jaw still swollen and bruised, read the letter, his eyebrows rising in surprise. He read it a second time, then walked over to the cells, a look of grudging disbelief on his face. "It seems," he announced, his voice laced with annoyance, "that you have both been very lucky." He held up the letter. "This is from the Texas Ranger handling the case of Elias Thorne. Thorne survived the fire. He was found weeks later by a traveling preacher, but he never pressed any charges against his wife. In fact, he told the Rangers he did not want her found, said he was ashamed, that he had driven her to it, and then he vanished, without a complainant. There is no crime. The warrant is withdrawn. You are free to go." The words seemed to hang in the air. Unreal. Clara stared at him, unable to process what she was hearing. Free? After all this, after everything, was it possible? Colt simply nodded, as if he had expected it all along. The sheriff, clearly disgusted at having been punched for nothing, unlocked their cells with a series of angry clicks. They walked out of the jailhouse into the afternoon sun, blinking in the bright light. The crowd was still there, but their jeers had been replaced by confused, suspicious murmurs. Their simple story had been ruined, and they stared at Clara and Colt with a mixture of resentment and hostility. They were not heroes, and they were not villains. They were just people, and that was something the town could not easily forgive. They retrieved their horses and rode out of Redemption Creek in silence, the eyes of the town on their backs. They did not stop until they reached the boundaries of Colt's land. As they rode up the trail toward the cabin, a strange, orange glow appeared over the ridge. A thick plume of black smoke was rising into the evening sky. Colt spurred his horse, his face a grim mask. They crested the ridge and saw it. The barn, the one he had built with his own 2 hands on the ashes of his family's home, was engulfed in flames. Jed McCluskey had made good on his promise. For a moment, they just stared, the roar of the fire a hungry, living thing. Then, without a word, they sprang into action. They grabbed buckets from the well, working in a desperate, frantic rhythm. They threw water on the flames, but it was like spitting into a furnace. The heat was intense, the smoke thick and choking. They worked side by side, their faces blackened with soot, their lungs burning. They were not just fighting a fire, they were fighting the hatred of the town, the cruelty of men like McCluskey, the relentless, destructive force of the past. They could not save the barn. It collapsed in on itself with a great, groaning crash, sending a shower of embers into the sky. They were left standing in the smoldering ruins, coughing, exhausted and defeated. The thing he had built was gone. The sanctuary he had offered her had been violated. Colt stood staring at the wreckage, his shoulders slumped. Clara came to stand beside him. She looked at the blackened timbers, at the scorched earth. She had run from a fire once, alone and terrified. But this time was different. She was not alone. She looked up at Colt, at his soot-stained face, at the despair in his eyes. The fear she had lived with for so long was gone, burned away in the heat of the flames, replaced by something harder, something stronger, a cold, clear resolve. She reached out and took his hand, her small, calloused fingers lacing with his. He looked down at her, surprised. She met his gaze, and her eyes were no longer haunted. They were clear and steady, filled with the fierce light of the fire. "I will fight beside you now," she whispered, her voice hoarse from the smoke. It was not a promise, it was a vow. The work of rebuilding began in the gray, smoky dawn. The air was thick with the ghost of the fire, the acrid smell of charred pine and shattered hopes. They did not speak of what was lost. They spoke only of what needed to be done. Colt, his face a grim mask of determination, began clearing the debris, his muscles straining as he hauled blackened timbers from the smoldering foundation.
Clara worked beside him, her small frame wiry and strong, her hands, already calloused from ranch work, now stained with soot. They moved in a silent, synchronized rhythm, a partnership forged in crisis. This was a different kind of building. The first barn had been Colt's solitary act of reclaiming his past. This new one was their joint act of defiance against the future. Every nail they hammered, every beam they hoisted into place, was a declaration. It said, "We are still here. You did not break us." The labor was grueling, a penance paid in sweat and exhaustion. At night, they would fall into their separate beds, too bone-weary for words, their bodies aching with a shared fatigue that was a strange kind of intimacy. Word of the fire and their survival had spread back to Redemption Creek. Carried on the wind with the smoke, the whispers in town shifted. The story was no longer just about a mysterious woman and the rancher who hid her. It was now about Jed McCluskey's cowardly act of arson and the couple who had refused to be driven out. Some still muttered that they had brought the trouble on themselves, but a new, grudging respect began to take root in the town's stony soil. The first sign of this shift came a week into their work. A wagon rattled up the trail, and Clara's first instinct was to reach for the rifle Colt kept propped against the cabin door. But it was only Mrs. Peterson, the elderly widow, her face etched with concern. She did not say much. She simply handed Clara a heavy canvas bag. Inside was a collection of nails, a hammer, and a slab of cured bacon. "A body needs to eat to work," the old woman said, her voice raspy. "And it is a sin to let good people suffer for the cowardice of fools." She squeezed Clara's hand, her touch frail but firm, and then she was gone. Clara stood holding the bag, tears blurring the half-built frame of the new barn. It was the first offering of community, the first thread of connection to a world she had thought would forever cast her out. A few days later, one of the widow's young grandsons appeared, a shy boy with big eyes, carrying 2 buckets of fresh water from their well. He set them down, mumbled, "Grandma sent this," and ran off before they could thank him. Slowly, tentatively, support began to grow. They were no longer entirely alone. But Clara knew that nails and water would not stop men like McCluskey. She had felt the icy grip of powerlessness for the last time. One evening, as Colt was cleaning his revolver by the firelight, she came to him. "Teach me," she said, her voice quiet but firm. Colt looked up, his hands stilling. He saw the look in her eyes, the hard, clear resolve that had replaced the fear. It was the same look he had seen in his own reflection years ago. He did not question her. He simply nodded, understanding that this was not about vengeance, but about survival. It was about never being a victim again. He gave her an older, smaller pistol, a Colt Peacemaker with a worn grip. He showed her how to hold it, how to load it, how to feel its cold, solid weight in her hand. Her training began the next day. While he worked on the barn, she would walk out into the canyons, away from the cabin, and practice. The first time she fired it, the sound was a violent explosion that rocked her to her core, the recoil jarring her arm. But she did not flinch. Day after day, she practiced. She learned to control her breathing, to squeeze the trigger with a slow, steady pressure, to aim not with her eyes alone, but with her entire body. She was not a natural, but she was determined. She shot at tin cans and knots on fence posts. Her quiet, steady practice a daily ritual of empowerment, a private vow that she would never again be defenseless. While Clara was forging a new strength, Colt was wrestling with a corrosive guilt. As he watched her ride out to practice, as he saw the new hardness in her eyes, a knot of doubt would tighten in his gut. He had brought her to his ranch to give her peace, a sanctuary from the world's cruelty. Instead, he had brought her deeper into his own violent life. He had seen her tremble at the sound of thunder. Now she was making thunder of her own with a pistol in her hand. Had he saved her, or had he simply taught her how to survive in a different kind of cage? The question haunted him in the quiet hours of the night,
a bitter counterpoint to the growing love he felt for her. One night, the sky broke open. A furious storm rolled in from the mountains, the wind howling like a hungry wolf, the rain hammering against the roof of the small cabin. Thunder cracked and boomed, shaking the very ground beneath them. They had finished the frame of the barn's loft that day, a skeleton of new pine that smelled clean and sharp in the rain-washed air. They sat inside the cabin, the storm a wild, violent symphony outside. The thunder was a constant barrage, and Colt saw the way Clara's shoulders tensed with each crash, the way her gaze darted toward the door. The old fears were not gone. They were just buried deeper now. He stood up and went to the hearth, taking down a half-empty bottle of whiskey. He poured a little into 2 tin cups. "Come on," he said, his voice low, a counter-rhythm to the storm. He led her out of the cabin and into the half-built barn. They climbed the ladder to the new loft. The wind and rain swept through the open walls, but the new roof held, a fragile shelter in the heart of the tempest. They stood there, looking out at the lightning as it tore jagged scars across the black sky. They drank the whiskey, the fiery liquid a welcome warmth against the storm's chill. In the enclosed space of the loft, with the world raging outside, the air between them grew thick with unspoken things, the fear, the hope, the love. It all coalesced into a single, unbearable tension. He looked at her face illuminated by a sudden flash of lightning, her eyes wide and dark. "I am scared, Clara," he confessed, the words torn from him, a confession he had never made to another living soul. "I am scared to hope. Everything I have ever tried to build, someone has come along and burned it down." She set her cup down and came to him. She did not offer empty reassurances. She did not tell him it would be all right. She simply took his large, calloused hands in her own, the hands that had taught her to ride, that had fought for her, that were now rebuilding their world. She raised them to her lips and kissed them, first one, then the other, a gesture of profound tenderness and absolute devotion. "I still cannot stop thinking about you," she whispered, her voice a raw, fierce truth against the roar of the storm. "Not when I'm awake, not when I'm asleep, not for a second." She looked up at him, and her eyes held a strength that mirrored his own. "Let them try to burn it down. We will just build it again." It was all the hope he needed. He pulled her to him, his mouth finding hers in the darkness. They made love that night in the loft, on a bed of haystacks. As the storm crashed and raged around them, it was a desperate, passionate claiming, a reclamation of life in the face of death. It was 2 broken people making each other whole, their bodies a vow against the world's judgment, their fierce, defiant love a brighter flame than any fire, a louder sound than any thunder. The storm passed, but the peace it left behind was short-lived. 2 days later, they came. Jed McCluskey returned, and this time he did not come to threaten. He brought 4 armed men with him, hard cases with dead eyes who looked like they had been scraped from the floor of a border town saloon. They were not there to talk, they were there to kill. The reward for Clara was just an excuse now. This was about pride, and the simple, brutal fact that Colt and Clara had defied him and survived. Colt saw them coming from a long way off, a cloud of dust on the horizon. "Inside," he said to Clara, his voice calm, but his eyes were cold and hard as steel. "Get the rifle, bar the door." She did as he said, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs, but her hands were steady. She took the rifle, checked the load, and positioned herself at the small window of the cabin. Colt took cover behind the low stone wall of the corral, his own rifle resting on the top stone, his movements economical and precise. McCluskey and his men rode in, spreading out in a loose semicircle, their guns already drawn. "Brenner!" Jed shouted, his voice full of a smug, ugly confidence. "We know you are in there. Throw the woman out, and we might let you live." The only answer was the deafening crack of a rifle, but it did not come from Colt. It came from the cabin.
One of McCluskey's men cried out, clutching his shoulder as he tumbled from his horse. Clara had fired first. She had seen the man raising his pistol to aim at the corral, and she had not hesitated. The world exploded into chaos. Gunfire erupted from all sides, the air filled with the whine of bullets and the screams of men. Colt, using the element of surprise Clara had given him, rose from behind the wall and fired. A lean, grim, brutal efficiency in his every movement. A second man fell. The gun for hire he had tried to bury was now fully awake, his instincts sharp, his aim true. The remaining men, their confidence shattered, took cover behind the rocks, firing wildly at the cabin and the corral. A bullet splintered the window frame inches from Clara's head, showering her with wood. But she did not flinch. She reloaded, her movements sure and practiced, and fired again. The fight was short and savage. Colt moved with a deadly grace, using the terrain to his advantage, his rifle speaking in short, punctuated bursts of death. When it was over, a profound, ringing silence fell over the ranch. Jed McCluskey lay dead, his eyes staring blankly at the sky. Two of his men were dead beside him. The one Clara had shot was moaning in the dust, and the last had fled, his horse a disappearing speck on the horizon. The land around them was scarred. The ground was littered with spent casings, the rocks chipped by bullets, and near the corral, Dust Devil, the gentle mare that had been Clara's first taste of freedom, lay on her side, a dark stain spreading across her coat. A stray bullet had found her. The adrenaline fled Clara's body, leaving a hollow, shaking emptiness. She ran to the horse, sinking to her knees beside the dying animal. She laid her head against its neck, her body racked with sobs, her tears mingling with the horse's blood. The cost of their survival was suddenly, terribly real. Colt came and stood over her, his face a mask of grief and exhaustion, and placed a hand on her shoulder. The sheriff arrived an hour later. Drawn by the sound of the gunfire, he surveyed the scene, the dead men, the wounded horse, the grim, resolute couple standing in the aftermath. He listened to Colt's flat, dispassionate account of what had happened. When Colt was finished, the sheriff looked not at him, but at the dead men. "I should have run Jed McCluskey in after he burned your barn," he said, his voice heavy with a weary resignation. "I was a fool. It seems you were right. Brenner, we have been harboring cowards in this county, not enforcing justice." He looked at Colt and Clara then, and for the first time, he saw them not as a problem, but as a solution. "This was self-defense. I will see to it that is how it is recorded." News of the shootout, of how Colt and Clara had stood their ground and fought off 5 men, spread through Redemption Creek and the surrounding valleys. The story was told and retold, each telling stripping away another layer of suspicion and replacing it with a grudging, hard-won respect. The townsfolk were shaken. They began to see the couple not as fugitives, not as troublemakers, but as what they truly were, survivors. Spring came slowly to that high, wounded country. It did not burst forth in a riot of color, but advanced cautiously. A quiet promise whispered in the softening of the wind and the slow retreat of the frost. The creeks, frozen silent through the winter, began to murmur again. And on the scorched earth around the new barn, the first stubborn shoots of green pushed their way through the ash, fierce and resilient. The land, like the 2 people who tended it, was healing, its scars a testament to the life that refused to be extinguished. The world of men, which had once been a source of such terror, began to cautiously reopen its doors to them. Their trips to Redemption Creek were different now. The jeers and hostile stares were gone, replaced by quiet, respectful nods. The whispers that followed them were no longer of suspicion, but of a grudging admiration. They were the couple who had faced down the McCluskeys, who had rebuilt from the ashes, who had, against all odds, endured. The first real invitation came on a cool spring afternoon. They had been in the general store, stocking up on supplies,
when the town's schoolteacher, a prim, earnest woman named Miss Albright, approached them. She addressed Clara directly, a gesture that was in itself a profound shift in the town's attitude. "Mrs. Brenner," she began, her use of the unofficial title making Clara's cheeks flush. "I was wondering if I might impose upon you. I have several older girls who are struggling with their letters. Their families need them for chores, and they fall behind. I have heard that you are a gentle soul. I thought, perhaps, you might be willing to spend an hour or two a week helping them read." Clara was struck dumb. The offer was a shock, a door opening into a life she had never imagined for herself. But with the shock came a cold wave of the old fear. To teach, to be a figure of respect in the community, would be to stand in the light. It meant being seen, being judged. The shadows she had lived in for so long still felt like the safest place to be. I do not know," she stammered, her gaze dropping to the floorboards. "I am not a teacher. I am not worthy." The words went unspoken, but they hung in the air between them. She felt a warm, steady pressure on her hand. Colt had moved to stand beside her, his presence a silent, solid anchor. He squeezed her hand gently, a small, private gesture that spoke volumes. He leaned in, his voice a low rumble meant only for her. "You are stronger than what they see," he said. His words were not a command or an argument. They were a simple statement of his faith in her. He saw not the fugitive, not the victim, not the haunted woman she still felt herself to be. He saw the woman who had faced down her past, who had learned to fire a gun, who had fought beside him and rebuilt their home. He saw her strength, and in his eyes, she began to see it, too. She took a deep breath, the air filling her lungs with a new, fragile courage. She looked up and met Miss Albright's hopeful gaze. "I would be honored to help," she said, her voice clear and steady. A new chapter began. Twice a week, Clara would ride into town and sit with a small group of girls in the back of the schoolhouse, the scent of chalk dust and ink filling the air. She was a patient and intuitive teacher, her own history of silence making her keenly aware of the girls' shy hesitations. She did not just teach them letters. She taught them that their voices mattered. And in teaching them, she found a new dimension to her own healing. Life on the ranch settled into a new kind of peace, one that felt less like a temporary ceasefire and more like a lasting truce. One afternoon, as they were mending a fence line on the far edge of the property, a sound made them both pause. It was a faint, pathetic whimpering, coming from a thicket of scrub oak. Colt, his hand instinctively going to the pistol at his hip, moved cautiously toward the sound. He parted the branches to find a dog, a half-wild mix of hound and something else, its coat matted and covered in burrs. One of its back legs was mangled, an old wound that had healed badly, causing it to limp. It snarled weakly, its eyes rolling with fear and pain, but it was too weak to run. Clara came to stand beside Colt. She saw not a threat, but a reflection of herself, a creature wounded, abandoned, and terrified of the world. "He is starving," she whispered. She went back to their saddlebags and returned with a piece of dried venison. She knelt on the ground, a respectful distance from the dog, and tossed the meat toward it. The dog watched it land, its sides heaving, then greedily snatched it up. For the next hour, Clara sat there, talking to the animal in a low, soothing voice, tossing it small pieces of food until, finally, its terrified snarling subsided into a low, cautious whine. By the time the sun began to set, the dog had limped out of the thicket and was lying a few feet away from her, its head on its paws, its weary eyes never leaving her face. They took him home. They named him Ghost, for the way he had appeared out of nowhere. He was a quiet, solemn animal, his limp a constant reminder of a painful past. He followed Clara everywhere, a silent, limping shadow. A few weeks after they found him, Clara was sitting on the porch of the cabin, tossing a small stick for him. Ghost, with a surprising burst of energy, managed to catch it in mid-air, his tail giving a single, tentative wag. The sight of the wounded, serious animal trying to play was so unexpected, so absurdly charming, that a sound escaped Clara's lips that she had not made in years. It was a laugh, not a small, hesitant chuckle, but a full, genuine laugh that came from deep within her, a sound of pure, unadulterated joy. Colt, who was coming from the barn, stopped in his tracks, his heart aching with a fierce, protective love. It was the most beautiful sound he had ever heard. The outside world tried to intrude one last time, not with violence, but with the more insidious threat of progress. A well-dressed man from the railroad company rode out to the ranch, his city clothes and polished boots a stark contrast to the rugged landscape. He brought with him maps, contracts, and a leather satchel full of money. Mr. Brenner," he said, his smile smooth and practiced. "The Transcontinental Railroad is a symbol of this great nation's future. We are building a spur line through this valley, and your property lies directly in our path. We are prepared to offer you a very generous sum for a right-of-way across your land. More money than this ranch will likely ever earn you." He unrolled a map on the porch railing, pointing to a thick black line that cut directly through Colt's best pasture and came within 100 yards of the cabin. Colt listened patiently, his face unreadable. He looked at the map, at the line that would bring the noise and smoke and constant traffic of the modern world crashing into their sanctuary. He looked at the new barn, standing proud and strong against the sky. He looked at Clara, who stood in the doorway of the cabin, Ghost at her side, her face a quiet question. This land was more than just dirt and rock to him. It was the ashes of his family. It was the sweat of his own labor. It was the place where he had found a reason to live again. It was the home he had built not just for himself, but for her. To sell a piece of it would be to sell a piece of their souls. He turned back to the railroad man, his decision absolute. "The answer is no," he said, his voice quiet but unyielding. "This land is not for sale." The man sputtered, clearly unaccustomed to refusal. "But sir, this is an incredible offer. It is for the good of the country." "The good of my country starts right here," Colt said, gesturing to the land around them. "This is my home. It is her home." He looked at Clara, and a silent understanding passed between them. This was theirs. "You will have to find another way around." The man, defeated by a force he could not comprehend, eventually packed up his maps and his money and left. Colt and Clara stood on the porch and watched him go. The silence he left behind feeling sacred and secure. They were married on a morning in early summer, as the sun was cresting the eastern mountains, painting the sky in strokes of rose and gold. The ceremony was not in a church, but beside the rebuilt barn, the scent of fresh-cut pine and wildflowers hanging in the air. Mrs. Peterson and her grandchildren were there, along with the blacksmith and his wife, and even Miss Albright, a small, quiet gathering of the few souls who had shown them kindness. Clara wore no white. She wore a simple dress of prairie blue, the color of the vast, open sky. She had woven a few wildflowers into her braid. She looked not like a bride from a storybook, but like a woman of the West, beautiful in her strength and resilience. Colt stood beside her, his usual work clothes replaced by a clean shirt, his face scrubbed, his eyes holding a depth of love and reverence that was a vow in itself. They did not have a preacher. They exchanged simple vows they had written themselves, their words plain and honest, their promises rooted not in poetry, but in the hard-won truths of their life together. They promised to be each other's shelter, to share the labor and the silence, to stand together against whatever storms might come. When it was done, Colt slid a simple, unadorned gold band onto her finger, and then he kissed her, a slow, gentle kiss that sealed their past and opened the door to their future. Afterward, instead of a celebration, Colt lifted her onto his horse, swinging up behind her. He wrapped his arms around her waist, pulling her back against his chest. with a quiet word to the horse. He guided them away from the small gathering, down the trail that led deep into the canyon valley, their own private cathedral. They rode in a comfortable silence, the only sound the soft clopping of the horse's hooves and the sigh of the wind. They rode until they came to a place where the canyon walls opened up, revealing a breathtaking vista of the mountains beyond. He reined in the horse, and they sat there, two small figures in a vast, majestic landscape. In the quiet, she leaned her head back against his shoulder, her hand covering his where it rested on her waist. "I am still haunted," she whispered, her voice so soft he could feel it more than hear it. "The memories, they do not go away completely, but you make the ghosts quieter." He tightened his arms around her, holding her as if he could absorb the last of her pain into himself. He pressed his lips to her hair, his answer a low, rumbling promise against her ear. "Then let us outlive them." The sun began its slow descent, dipping behind the jagged peaks of the mountains, setting the sky ablaze. They sat there on the horse, watching the day come to a close, their shadows stretching long behind them. They were bruised. They were imperfect. Their life was a testament to the scars they carried, both inside and out. But as they looked out at the vast, beautiful, and unforgiving land that they now called home, they were finally, truly, at peace. Thank you for gathering around the campfire with us tonight. Let us know where you are listening from in the comments so we can all connect. Be sure to subscribe to the Wild West Campfire channel and share your thoughts in English.